Hi everyone, Simon from Horoma Studio. Today I wanted to do a little teardown of my own work. This will be tackling a funny project I did in Montreal with a firm, and it was regarding a sort of plaza refurbishment in the center of Montreal. It was a very fun project. I think it went really well. Everyone was very happy with the result. There are still things that in retrospect I would do slightly differently. So I'll try to walk you through it's going to be very straightforward, I think. I'm going to walk you through the different types of point of views that I tried and started working with, the ones we ended up choosing, and how we went version from version to the final image, and how maybe the final image could still be improved in terms of just overall quality. So let's have a look at that. So maybe first I should actually show you the final image so that we have a better look at what was going on. It was a set of two images for, as I was saying, a sort of a new plaza. This is one of the point of view, and this is the other one. So very fun images, kind of playful, and sort of, I think, conveying the idea of the project quite well. So if I want to sort of explain the project first, it was one idea that was this sort of arc here, that was supposed to be quite mineral, and then the second arc was more about this idea of recreating a sort of biotop or whatever with proper trees, and sort of try to bring back some sort of nature in the city with small animals, etc. To have a lot of squirrels and stuff there, which is quite fun, and also having a proper understanding of how water and the vegetation would work together. So there was some sort of stuff that were needed to be shown in the image, but we'll have a look at that a little bit better in a little bit later. Point of views that were tried were many of them, because it's a large scale project, so there are many opportunities to show it. One of the two big guidelines, I think, that we were going through and that we sort of agreed upon was this idea of having maybe one very larger shot that would show the whole plaza and how it would be perceived from the city, and another one that would be more on the plaza in the vegetation part, in order to show better the sort of pavilion thing, and show the sort of contrast that will happen once you're inside that space and looking at the city that is a little bit just behind the trees. So really playing on this very stark contrast in between the two sort of atmospheres that we were trying to convey, and that we were trying to create in the project. So here we have a couple of options that were pretty interesting. You can see that since you have a lot of vegetation, you can play with a lot of very interesting cast shadows, and sort of have very strong contrast, and have this sort of idea of reveal, where the project sort of suddenly appears in the middle of the sort of nature, etc. So there's a lot of potential for very strong images. Here it is quite close to the final image we went for the exterior one, where we're basically kind of on the limit of the plaza, as I was saying, and we're sort of overlooking the vegetation that is in the middle of this sort of very interesting skyline. So something quite interesting and pretty compelling. Here, even the lighting is not very interesting. It was more this idea of being still on this sort of sidewalk. This would still be a concrete path, and here you would have this sort of more vegetation part, but this was a bit lacking sky, etc., and feeling a little bit maybe claustrophobic, actually, which is kind of counterintuitive. Here it's kind of many options. I won't go through all of them because this would make no sense, but the overall idea, as I said, was really to have this sort of too broad approach to the project. One thing though that I noticed, this one is very fun because you have this sort of different lines and planes of composition that is very fun. One thing, I really actually liked this image, and in retrospect I think it could have been a quite very good candidate, because it was really emphasizing different we still kept this sort of idea of the city being part of the backdrop, And this whole new pavilion that was this sort of like place where we could interact and rest, etc., away from the city, and we could have like had a better emphasis on the heart of the pavilion here, but we didn't go that way and stayed out of the pavilion, which is an also interesting option, but maybe I was not entirely convinced by it. This one also was a bit cute, but maybe a little bit too far from the pavilion, which would then be quite redundant with the other image that we went for the more general view. Here, this one was not very interesting, and here this is also kind of the same. Second research here is like when we start, how can I say, like reorganizing a little more the point of view based on what we sort of wanted to go for. So these are like very basic renderings with kind of the vegetation a little bit more like at least textured, even though we didn't go for this sort of color palette at all. And sort of like lighting tests that were started. And here we had, like, as you can see, this sort of like idea of suggesting water, etc. So this one was going quite quickly because it was actually quite simple, if I may say, where we're just like refining the vegetation, and then it was like a matter of like actually integrating the background. So if we look at the final, not the final, but like the start of the image, if we look at the pavilion one to say, for instance, this was the first one. First option, or like first iteration. As you can see, we had like something that was very like muddy, and this idea of like something very natural. Here was just a 3D person that was gonna move at some point, but it was just to get a sense of scale. And there were many things to change here, but the overall idea was to play with like this sort of like interesting slight fog effect, and this idea of having something kind of like hazy around the whole project in order to really create this sort of like subspace away from the city. So this is like a better iteration where I was starting to integrate all the sort of like backdrops that were, I think they were mainly done with photographs that were taken on site, so that was a bit easier to work with, even though there was like a lot of stitching involved because the actual place here was like a car park but not really accessible. Here you can see there was like this idea of making this slightly more accessible, but still it was far off from what we ended up with because we needed something way more, let's say, inviting and accessibility friendly. So that was it. I think one thing that was interesting, but that maybe got a bit lost, is that there was like some ramps going on, and it was a bit hard to sort of suggest it as well as we were hoping. And the vegetation still needed a little bit of refining. But the overall lighting was there, and we were like quite happy with the sort of turn it was getting. Here you can see like how the color palette is changing slightly. We're going a little bit away from the more yellowish thing and getting something that is actually looking a little bit too dark right now, but this is not the final image. We're changing the vegetation a little in order to fit better what the landscapist had in mind. There was like some stuff like these that were added, but that needed to be much smaller in the end. Small details were added in terms of like small foreground elements in order to better be like pushed into the image, if I may say. The background was probably a little bit refined, but maybe not that much. But that was the overall idea. And I think final image, as you can see, is slightly brighter and slightly warmer. One thing though that I'm noticing now and that I don't really like, I think the lighting is on point, because I just do like a quick critique of this image. I think the lighting is fine and has like the right orientation. I think this is a little bit too dark and would have been interesting in order to emphasize it a little bit more, because here it's fine to have this sort of like darker areas, and we have like here the suggested water that I think is working nicely. It's just here the vegetation for some reason is a little bit too dark, not like fluffy enough, if I may say. So this is, I think, one of the main drawback from it. It looks very like luxuriant or whatever, so it's nice and it sort of fits the intent of the image, but it does lack a little bit of a bit more punch, if I may say. So that would be the main critique, I think. Maybe, as I was saying, it's like really I think I was more inspired by the idea of being inside, or a little bit, maybe we would have required to be slightly closer to this pavilion element in order to feel more inside of it rather than outside of it. That we would have had, as I was saying, explaining the earlier point of view, have something really in the heart of the place, emphasizing this sort of island here, and then sort of having all this being a sort of like backdrop with the city in the background. So yeah, very simple but yet very interesting point of view. I think it was still like working quite nicely and everyone was still happy with it, but of course always in retrospect you find things that can be sort of improve, of course. Maybe also one thing is that I think the volumetric effect was a little bit too strong. When you start losing contrast in these, it's a bit of a pain, or like a shame, sorry, because having this sort of like having these highlights in the trees is something that really catches the attention, but in a good way, and creates like a lot of depth in an image. So that's why, like, for instance, this sort of like very nice highlight that we have here, it would have been interesting to have them recreated in here. So probably there was like a sort of middle ground to find in terms of the sort of foggy aerial perspective, in order to have something that would make the vegetation a little bit more, a little bit better, basically. Because here you can see it's like we have this sort of like fluffy look that is very nice. Here we're kind of lacking it because it's further, but we would like, I think, to keep it. So that was maybe one of the main things. When we look at the other image, which was the sort of plaza one, here's the base we started from. This one was supposed to be sort of really autumnal, so I quickly went for this idea of like really overplay the what's the word, like the fallen leaves, etc., in order to sort of get away from this very rigid look of the paving, which, even though it's like a very nice material, we can play, like, we needed sort of like several extra layers in order to make it more interesting, because otherwise we would have ended up with a very mineral and white foreground, which wouldn't have been very nice. So having this sort of extra layer of like fallen leaves and sort of like after the shower, like rain shower thing with like sort of wet areas, etc., that gives really nice reflection and sort of like emphasize the very stark sun, etc., was, I think, an interesting way to go. Here, of course, there was a lot of work, extra work required, but it gives a very good first idea of how this is gonna look. Here, the 3 people were gonna disappear, but it were nice to have them at first in order to understand the sort of like scale, etc. So, and how we can start to sort of use the elements. Here's the second version, which is a quite big step up, as you can see. We have more variation in terms of colors in the vegetation, so it makes it way more interesting. Here we start having fun with like how we can start putting kids, etc., playing with like leaves. So this was pretty fun to play with, and the idea was really to create sub-stories everywhere in order to show how active the plaza can be. One thing also that was done is to again stitch all these elements in order to get a pretty convincing backdrop, but still also one thing that was nice, and this is kind of a simple trick, but it does work if it fits your intent and your story, if I may say, is that once you have this sort of aerial perspective, it helps in stitching together and sort of blending together the background and the foreground quite easily. Because if you keep it in a more like very middle of the day harsh light, it's very complicated to get matching lights and to sort of very properly integrate the project. So here it was kind of a good thing, because it fitted the requirements and it made things slightly easier to work with. If we look at the next version here, so there were some changes regarding the vegetation because we needed higher stuff punctually. Here there was this thing where actually there was like another tower that was getting built, so but it was going to be changed again in the next rendering. Then I was starting to play with small like pigeons and things like that because they are quite fun to play with when you want to add elements, but not like an actual human that catches quite a lot of attention. So simple pigeons, etc., are actually a good way to go. What you don't want to is to have like millions of them, even though, well, it could be a way to animate your image, but still this is something that is a little bit less selling and can be quite scary in a way. Beside that, it was more like integration of the background, I think, and some elements that were pushed like and more organized in order to open more on this area, because as you can see here, it was maybe blocking a little bit too much the view. So here we're changing a little bit that. And the final image is this one. So you can see it was mainly about fine-tuning some elements and fine-tuning the integration. Here we had some sort of like edges that were not good looking, and here this was like a 3D model that was integrated instead of playing with 2D that was not very high quality. One thing also regarding the image, so now that I have it here and that I kind of haven't seen it in quite a bit of time, I think just like for the other image with the sort of fog, there was probably a sort of, not necessarily an in-between, but something to do in order to make it slightly better. I really like basically all this area, for instance, is very nice, and I think the sort of values in general are okay and interesting. I think the stories that we're creating were nice. There's still something, I think, regarding the floor that was a little bit that needed a little more refining. What's the word? The puddle of water, etc., would have maybe required slightly more work, and maybe there was something that could have been done again with water in the foreground in order to anchor a little bit more. In terms of people, I think it was fine, and sort of like the stories created were pretty convincing. Maybe these elements needed a little bit more work in terms of modeling in order to sort of understand slightly better how to use them, because here it's kind of hard to understand how to use them. And maybe just in terms of like the overall feeling is that, but this is how the project is. It's like there's this very big mass here. I think the pavilion gets a little bit too much lost. So there was something I think that needed to be done in order to rearrange the values and make it slightly stand out more. Because here it's a little bit lost, I think, in the elements. And one thing I think also that I'm not happy with is that the integration of people sometimes is a bit like this girl is a little bit too dark and not like hazy enough, or like this guy maybe as well. And here the transition maybe is not as smooth as one would hope. So that would be like the sort of small element that could be done. But overall, the point of view here I think was properly chosen and conveying properly this sort of idea of the like discrepancies between those two elements of the like conceptual elements of the plaza. So yeah, that's all for these two images. As I said, it was going to be quite straightforward in order just to show how maybe you can use this sort of ideas of like when you're dealing maybe with like public space, and how you can have different typologies of framing and have like broader ideas and then smaller ideas and smaller scale in order to combine them and get like all the different aspects or like conceptual perceptions that you would be looking forward to convey in your image. So that's all for the project. Overall, as I said in the introduction, I was quite happy with the overall outcome. The clients were very happy with it, so that was the main thing anyway. There are always like stuff that can be refined. Mainly here was like the vegetation, I think, needed a little bit more refining in order to be a little bit more like, even though there were like parts of it that were like fluffy and good looking and sort of like interesting and welcoming, some other parts were a little bit too like dull and lacking a little bit of contrast, and this was due to not the most subtle way of using aerial perspective. So this is something you need to be always wary of, is that aerial perspective is a very interesting tool to use. It's just you really need to be aware of how it completely changes the values in your image, and you need to make sure that you retain the highlights that you want, because sometimes for specific materials such as like bricks or vegetation and especially, it's something very interesting to have like very interesting highlights and shadows, so that things are like gives and retain their like depth, if I may say. So I'll stop there. Hopefully you've learned some interesting stuff, and I'll see you in the next teardown. Cheers guys, bye.